The Korean League of Legends player Apdo, or Dopa as he's sometimes known, is one of the most intriguing, enigmatic, and talented League of Legends players probably ever to play the game. And yet he is someone who has never, in any meaningful sense, competed competitively or been relevant as a competitive player, and has never turned his eye really to that sort of that dimension of the game, despite the fact that is obviously the pinnacle of talent and where we judge players and how good they are overall. He's someone where I'll put it in the description box below. I wrote an article where I investigated within the Korean scene. I really reached out to people. I got things translated, and I wrote out kind of his story and what made him so interesting and such an outlaw figure, and yet clearly demonstrate the sheer talent he has, but the very unique philosophy for the game and for this Korean scene that the guy had. Because he's someone who initially everyone finds out about him because of the very controversial nature of him, which is that he was someone who was boosting accounts. And that was the main thing he initially became famous for, especially in the West. But he represents something much more than that. And that is really kind of doing him a disservice to just put him as someone who's just someone who boosts accounts, because this guy's talent level was ridiculous. I mean, he really is Faker-esque in terms of his ability at the game and the consistent ability to become very good and to return back again. And there's really no luck involved. This is a guy who has a fantastic talent and that has developed it and honed it and has his own philosophy on how to play the game and his own kind of game knowledge. And it's clearly just a prodigy level talent. I mean, the only other person I would actually put in the same category as Faker, Apdo, the only other one I actually would put in there is Rush, because here's another person who his ability level just seems to be utterly insane. I mean, these guys can do things in solo queue, in any game you put them in, with any teammates or opponents, that just defy belief. Like, other people are within a certain level, and these guys just have something extra about just the talent level and just the individual ability at the game. So one of the things that showed how fantastic Apdo is that obviously the Korean ladder in ranked is the hardest in the world. It's most populated by the best players. It doesn't just have Koreans, by the way. It has some of the top Chinese players, some of the best LMS players. And this guy has repeatedly, and more so than anyone else, shown that it is easy for him to get accounts into the challenger division of Korean solo queue. I mean, this guy can do it pretty much in record time. We're talking like in a week and a half. He can just get new accounts up there. So even compared to other elite Korean players, there's something ridiculous about him when it comes to solo queue. And as a result, this is what makes him crazy. That's where the whole criminal background comes in, where he boosts accounts, where he makes money. Because normally people who boost accounts are like lower level pros, or they're like a good player who's just boosting someone a few divisions below them, a few levels below them, a few ranks below. This is an example of someone who has among the most talent we've ever seen at the game, and then decided, right, well, since I've got the most talent and I could in theory get an account up there the fastest, I will be a booster. I will be the ultimate booster. I'll be the best booster who ever lived. I'll be the Faker of boosting, essentially. And he really did go down that route. I mean, one of the reasons why this happened is early on, he actually used his ability to get so high in solo queue as a way to immediately start a business within boosting. What he did was he would get accounts into Challenger, and then he would change the account name to something along the lines of like best boosting service guaranteed or something. So then people would start messaging, contacting him, and then he'd go and he'd switch over to their account, he'd boost them up. And when he actually started, he tried to like compete in a team called Dark, actually. And he was going to try and qualify for OGN just on the side with some friends. And he was banned by Riot for 1,000 years on the account. And is a multiple accounts have been banned, but obviously living in Korea, and especially in Korea, either using a VPN or you can just go to a PC bang, they'll never be able to stop you playing when you can create free accounts in League of Legends. You can always create new ones. You can always get ones off other people as well. It's very easy. So this is a guy who was boosting, not just for money, though. That's the key thing. He was initially doing it for money, and money was obviously clearly a primary motivator as a return for his work. But back then, Korean players, we're talking about like 2014 going into 2015. Back then, Korean players were not paid well for their work. That's why there was the Korean exits to China. That's why even some lower level Chinese Korean players just went there for the money. So he just looked at the scene and saw, right, you don't make that much money, even if you're the best in League of Legends. You have to live in a team house. You have all these negatives. You have all these lack of freedoms, all these freedoms you give up to become a pro. So instead, he was like, I'm going to be fantastic. I'm going to play in solo queue. I'm just going to boost, and I'm going to be the one who has the highest boosting. I'm going to be the guy who gets the most money that way. And so he was actually a figure who wasn't just doing it for the lols or just to be an asshole. He was doing it as a logical decision, as like a philosophy of how he wanted to live his life. And in doing so, was standing outside of Korean culture actually, and standing for individualism in a scene which actually was incredibly homogenous and very, very restrictive and repressive in terms of how Korean players were treated and how they were expected to behave. There was this period where in China, a streaming company offered, they initially said it was going to be 160,000 for someone who by a certain date could be number one on one of the Chinese servers. So Apdo went over to China and he started streaming himself doing it. Like he could have just got up there anyway. Obviously you had to stream on this service as it is, but he made it known who he was and he started streaming it, and it took him something like 21 days to get an account from the beginning to number one ranking challenger, and he won the prize. Now, in the end, it didn't end up being 160,000; it ended up being $80,000. But this is with everyone knowing who he is, and this is with loads of Chinese people trolling him and purposely throwing the game and trying to fuck with him. They couldn't stop him. That's how prodigious this guy's talent level is, and he could do it in China, obviously, where they're all speaking Chinese. He doesn't know fucking Chinese, and he's a Korean guy, and he's able to do it even on that sort of a ridiculous setting and server background. And this is where actually the famous photographs came of him when he collected the money, this big tray of money, where he looks like some straight baller, which looks like a fucking anime villain. Famously, this is actually the one that Theon used to use as his Twitter avatar for a long time, actually. That's Apdo. He's a guy where not only is he incredible, but people forget. We take for granted in League of Legends, okay, yeah, well, you can be like Rush, okay? You could be like a godlike jungler who's so sick, and every game you get ahead, and you snowball your team, and it's like, how is he so good? But we forget, well, yeah, his role, obviously. You know, Rush plays jungler, and he can get any account he wants up there. The sick thing about Apdo is he can play practically every single role in the game and be good enough to get accounts super high up in Challenger. Now, that's not even the case for Faker. In general, Faker is a god at mid lane, obviously. He's the best player of all time. But beyond mid lane, yeah, he plays jungle pretty well. He has like a couple of other roles he can play. Apdo can play essentially every role. That's how fantastic he is. And in fact, famously, he is known as a mid laner. He's known as a godlike mid laner, particularly for his TF and Rise, etc. But actually, this is a guy where he is unbelievable at jungle as well. If you watch him play that, it's so clear that his understanding of the game is very unique, but it's very, very effective. And the way he updates it, like the way he thinks about the game really is like how on whichever role he plays to snowball the game. That's one of the reasons he's so famous for his TF, because he'll take the TF and he'll do what TF obviously can do at its limits, which is just snowball the whole game and be all over the map and having massive map pressure and getting everyone else rolling and getting the team going. That's the whole point of what he does. Someone like Faker is godlike and is very, very good, but he has more of the competitive within my role mindset of this is how I'm going to play the game. And that's one of the things that makes Apdo so unique in that sense. His game knowledge is very, very deep. I mean, for mid lane, he knows so much, it's unbelievable. I mean, one of the ways he actually initially came to be famous was on a site called DC Insight, sort of like a Korean 4chan, if you want to call it that, but like the gaming subs. He started writing guides, and he was writing guides for certain things. And famously, his masteries and his rune setups and his thoughts on the meta are always very interesting. He's not someone who just follows the meta game and just spams those champions and just becomes the best. He innovates. He does what he wants. He plays the champions he wants to, and he's super successful doing so. So this is a guy where he's done numerous streams where he'll explain things about how to play the lane, how to play with this certain champion and this certain matchup, what he thinks you should do, when you should trade. One of the interesting things is one of the ways that I actually think people have thought that LS is an idiot by hyping Apdo, but actually LS is right to study Apdo and to look what he's doing, because it's going to give you all these interesting ideas, these new ways of thinking about the game. You're going to see someone with a Faker level talent, but that no one's following. Therefore, you're going to have all these insights into stuff that he's doing no one else is going to be on board with, which is a fantastic resource if you want to be a world-class analyst at League of Legends. I mean, you just have to go and look at some of the games where he's playing TF and you'll see how ridiculous this guy's not only ability is and skill level, but then the way he applies it to win the game. That's primarily what he's trying to do, is win the game. Not try to just be flashy or try to be cool or try to be arrogant. He's trying to win the game, because remember, originally he came from boosting. I mean, he's not really doing boosting as much nowadays. The sick thing about Apdo is if the Korean scene wasn't the way it was and it had a lot more money early on, this guy could have been another Faker. I mean, he really is of that level where that's the sort of what-if scenario we're talking about here. There's other people saying, oh, what about BDD? And he's like, no, these people are not the same what-if. They have a million miles from that. They have potential, and you hope it goes another way, and they have a great starting point. Apdo is so much more than that. So he's one of the very rare talents that you get in games, and particularly in League of Legends. And what people don't understand, I always say this, is a point I always make about Fakers. They didn't have to be a Faker. You could have had every other player in the world. You could have had twice as many people play League of Legends, and it's no guarantee you will get a faker. That's what sort of a one-off these people are. And it's actually not about number of players. Like, for example, I think in Quake we found our faker. We had this guy called Cypher who had it all, especially when he started to put together the mental game. His talent level was just it was inconceivable. And that was with a game that didn't have many people playing it at all. So again, we got very lucky to get our faker in that game. I mean, right now, there probably is another faker. Problem is, he's probably Chinese and he either plays Dota or League of Legends, and he's just never gone to a high level. He's never attempted to play in the competitive scene. We'll never know who he is, unfortunately. That's one of the reasons why in games like CSGO, I actually think it's sad that Valve has fucked up the publishing so much we don't really have the Koreans, because we'll never know which amazing Kenny S there probably is in Korea, or which Olaf Meister they would have in China if they had enough people playing, and therefore enough competition that eventually, hopefully, the faker played CSGO instead of League of Legends or Dota 2. That's the point. Even when you have the massive number of people, there's lock-in in terms of which game this guy finds his way into, etc. I mean, it's actually amazing how many of the top Korean legendary players play that game Chaos, which obviously wasn't a huge game outside of Korea, really. So this guy, you can't really underestimate how incredibly talented he is. So you can read the article, there's tons of VODs of him online, especially highlight clips. It's really someone worth checking out because it's a fantastic what if. But even the way he lived his life, it has validity, it's interesting, and there's a philosophy behind it, and it's a fascinating guy.